We're here at KW Vintage Games, and they've got a whole bunch of video games in the store, but in their storage room, well, they've got a whole lot more. So today, we're gonna try and find some cool random stuff that you've probably never seen before. The CP System 2 was a series of arcade systems that were released in the 90s, and this is what one of the games for those systems looked like. This is Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and it's a massive block, but inside this block is all the components required to play this game. And what you would do is hook it up to the arcade system and you'd be able to play the game that's on here. These are pretty rare and not very easy to find, and they're pretty expensive, but if you can find one, they're really cool collectibles. There's a whole bunch of video games up here that were released in different regions, and these two games here did come out in North America, but these are the Japanese releases on the Nintendo 64, Pokemon Stadium and Ogre Battle 64. These are two really fun games, and if you take a look at the Japanese versions, you can tell that the box art are completely different compared to the North American releases. So this is a ColecoVision Atom. This box is about the size of me because it comes with pretty much everything you'd need to use the system besides a monitor. It comes with a printer, a tape deck, a keyboard, a whole bunch of controllers, manuals, and a whole bunch of other stuff. This is kind of becoming more difficult to find over time, specifically boxed, simply because of the size of this thing. Most people would just throw it out. So it's really rare and really uncommon to find one of these complete and with a box. This is the Lloyd's Color TV Sports 813. This system isn't that hard to find, but it is pretty rare to find in box. But one of the reasons why I want to talk about this system isn't about the games. It's because this system originally came with a rifle that you would shoot at the TV. Now, it's a light gun like you'd seen in other systems, but this one looked really real. In fact, if somebody looked at it from a distance, it would look like a real rifle that you could buy from an actual gun store. It's kind of hilarious to see stuff like this was sold for kids back in the day. But nowadays, when you see kind of light guns that are sold for TVs, they have really bright color schemes to make sure they look like toys. Back in the 70s though, they didn't really care too much. This here is a boxed Magnavox Odyssey. Now if you guys have seen my first video game console ever video, you saw me talk about the brown box. Well, the brown box eventually led to the creation of this, the Odyssey. It's a really cool system and kind of not that easy to find nowadays boxed. And if you can ever find one, it's weird. It's kind of like a Pong system, but it's cool. Really neat find. This here is a Fairchild Channel F. Now this is a boxed version, everything in here is complete, and what's hilarious about this is that if you don't know what a Fairchild Channel F is, well, video game history kinda does. This here is the first video game system to use multi-cartridges to change out games, and it also was the first system to ever use a microprocessor. If it wasn't for this console, you probably wouldn't have the NES, you probably wouldn't have a whole bunch of other video game systems that allow you to switch games, because up until this point, a console had the games built in, and the Channel F changed everything. When Sega was producing the Sega Genesis, they created a bunch of different models. Now personally, I own the second model, which kind of looked a little bit smaller than the first one. But they also released a third model, and this is what the third model looked like, and this is the box it originally came in. It's a really small version of the original Sega Genesis and pretty much is bare bones, but it's a cool system and honestly, a pretty good collectible if you can find one. This here's a pretty cool find. This is a multi-game cart for the Atari. It's got a couple switches on the front, and basically you'd switch the switches in a specific way according to what they actually say on the back of the cartridge, and you'll have a bunch of different games that you could play. Instead of having an options menu in the game to select stuff, you had to use switches, which was kind of weird, but this is something that did exist back for the Atari, and it's pretty cool. I just showed you the Odyssey 1, well here's the Odyssey 2. While it isn't in a box, I'm sure it's around here somewhere, this is the sequel to the original Odyssey. Not as successful, and sadly it didn't really work in the marketplace, but it's still a pretty cool system and has a lot of history behind it. If you've ever played Duck Hunt, well, a lot of you have probably played the second game that's included on the cartridge, which is just basically skeet shooting. They throw discs up in the air and you shoot them with your zapper. Well, a company thought, hey, why don't we just make a game that's just skeet shooting? This is CD Shoot, and it's for the CDI, which is made by Philips. It's not a very good game, and the controls for the CDI are not that great either. But if you're into skeet shooting, you can play this. And I don't recommend that you do. This next game is kind of a newer release, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys know it. This is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, only this version comes with a second game in the case. And that second game is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And this specific disc version comes with a Master Quest version of that game that basically makes it a little bit harder. Now, while this game has been released in multiple formats for the GameCube, this one is specific to this release. It's a really cool find, and honestly, it's really, really rare. This here is Nintendo's Virtual Boy, but the Japanese release box. Now this is kinda cool because I personally like the design of this box over the North American release. And although a lot of people don't like the system too much, it's still a pretty cool thing to find. So I just showed you the Virtual Boy, but this is rarer and even cooler. This is the Virtual Boy plastic collector's case that pretty much you'd use when you were renting the system at a Blockbuster. Now this is really neat because these were never actually sold. What happened was that when Blockbuster was originally renting out Virtual Boys, eventually they had to sell them because no one was renting them, and eventually Nintendo cut the line away. So when that happened, these things became a collector's dream because it was the best way to actually have your Virtual Boy in a collectible case and pretty much keep it safe. They're pretty rare, pretty uncommon to find, and although they're probably not that expensive, they're still pretty cool to own. This is Wacky World's Creativity Studio, and it was released by Sega for the Sega Genesis. Now, most people don't really remember this, and it's kind of a crappy thing, and that's why they don't remember it, but it's kind of important, because this game came with a mouse. Now, while most people know the Super Nintendo had a mouse, a lot of people don't realize that a Mario Paint-like game came out for the Sega Genesis. And this was it, starring Sonic the Hedgehog and Tails. It's kind of a weird game. It does work, but it's not one of the best games on the system. That's kind of why we forgot about it. But still, it's a cool collectible. And really, it's a thick box just so they could fit the mouse in there. So here's a kind of cool find. This is a Coleco Gemini. Now, if you don't know what this is, it's pretty much an Atari 2600 clone, not made by Atari, and made by Coleco, another company that was making video game systems at the time. It's kind of an oddity, and it's really weird. Not super rare, but just sort of illegal. They probably weren't allowed to do this, but they still did it anyway, and I don't think they really got in trouble for it. A very funny system to exist, and kind of a cool one to find. Anyway, guys, we've pretty much looked at a lot of things in this room, and there's probably thousands of more things we could find. And I don't really want to go through every tiny thing in here because we'd probably be here for a couple of years. But this is a really cool place to look at for random oddities and things that you just don't think exist in the world. And they exist here, probably somewhere in a box.